The first thing I heard in my new neighborhood wasn't a friendly welcome or the sound of moving trucks, it was a voice shrieking, "Get off this property before I call the police." I hadn't even closed the door of my U-Haul when Karen Dawson, clipboard in hand, stormed up my driveway with the fury of a tax auditor and the posture of someone who hadn't smiled since 1998. She didn't ask my name, didn't say hello, she just pointed at my face like I'd broken into her dream home and started squatting. She looked at my wife, then at our dog, then at the house like the whole thing was some sort of elaborate prank. "This home isn't on the approved purchase list," she declared. "You're not a real homeowner." I could only blink, trying to figure out whether I was in a sitcom or about to go viral for all the wrong reasons. What she didn't know, and what made this whole encounter hilarious, was that I wasn't just a homeowner. I was about to become her boss in the most poetic way possible. The neighborhood was called Sterling Estates, a gated HOA-run community that prided itself on its clean sidewalks, monthly bake-offs, and soul-crushing restrictions. The house itself was perfect. 3 bedrooms, modern kitchen, even a backyard with just enough slope for a hammock. My wife and I had closed on it 2 weeks earlier after months of searching for a peaceful place to settle. I was finally ready to live a quieter life, away from the chaos of city deals and legal battles. I ran a private equity firm that specialized in failing community developments and bankrupt HOAs, a detail I didn't feel like advertising. I wanted peace, not paperwork. That hope disintegrated in less than 24 hours. Karen marched closer, her gray Powerwalk sneakers squeaking with every step. "Sir, you need to step away from this home. We've had issues with trespassers, and I don't see your name listed in the homeowners directory." She flipped her clipboard like it was a legal document issued from the Supreme Court of Suburbia. My wife tried to answer, but Karen cut her off. "I'm not talking to tenants. I'm talking to whoever's pretending to own this lot." I calmly pulled out my phone and opened the digital deed. "My name is Jacob Reyes. I bought this property 2 weeks ago through Silverstone Realty. Here's the closing doc, mortgage proof, and the official title from the county clerk's office." Karen squinted at the screen like it was in another language, then scoffed. "That's not the right format," she snapped. "Real homeowners use printed forms. You could have photoshopped that." She pointed at my dusty Jeep and muttered something about non-residents dragging down property values. Then she took a picture of my moving boxes and walked away, saying, "Expect a violation letter before the weekend." My wife and I exchanged a glance that said everything. Welcome to the war zone. That evening, while unpacking, we were interrupted again. This time by 2 guys in fluorescent orange vests and polos that read, "Sterling Estates Compliance Unit." They claimed they were responding to a complaint about unauthorized landscaping materials and excessive trash exposure. I looked at them, then at the closed garbage bin and 4 sealed boxes of mulch I hadn't even opened. I asked if this was a prank. They didn't laugh. They handed me a pink slip of paper and said the fine would be emailed by morning. It was a $125 citation for daring to move in. I couldn't decide if I was more annoyed or impressed by the speed of Karen's nonsense. Over the next 3 days, the citations kept coming. One for not having my curtains installed yet. One for parking a non-luxury vehicle on the street overnight. One for letting my golden retriever roam, while she was literally tied to our front porch. Karen even had the gall to drop off a copy of the HOA rulebook with yellow tabs sticking out of every page she wanted us to review more carefully. I started asking the neighbors if this was normal. Most of them looked like they'd been through it before. One woman whispered that Karen had tried to evict a family last year because their toddler played with sidewalk chalk. Another said she was fined $500 because her Halloween decorations featured too many pumpkins. Everyone seemed scared to speak out loud, and all of them warned me not to provoke her further. I wasn't planning on provoking anyone. But that didn't mean I was going to take this quietly either. The turning point came when I received a letter in a cheap envelope slipped under my door. It read, in poor grammar, "You are not a recognized resident of this community and must provide physical proof of ownership or vacate the property. This notice is final." There was no official HOA letterhead, no board member signature. Just Karen's name in curly cursive like it was a signature on a kindergarten art project. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I realized Karen was out of control. She was using the HOA not as a governance tool, but as her personal kingdom. And as fate would have it, that kingdom was on the verge of collapse. You see, Sterling Estates had been quietly bleeding money for the past 4 years. I had read the financials when we bought the house. The HOA had taken out multiple loans to repair the community clubhouse, maintain the pool, and install new security gates, none of which were sustainable on their current dues structure. The board had been trying to refinance but couldn't find a buyer. They were months from defaulting. What Karen didn't know was that her little fiefdom was sitting on a financial landmine. I called my friend Lana, a real estate attorney with a sharp tongue and a love for dismantling bureaucratic nightmares. I gave her one sentence: "I want to buy the HOA," quietly. She laughed for a good 30 seconds, then said, "Tell me everything." We moved fast. Through a shell company, we approached the bank that held the HOA's debt. They were eager to sell. Within 5 days, I was the majority debt holder. The next step? Foreclosure on the HOA board's control, allowing for a buyout of the entire charter. With one stroke, I would legally become the new HOA owner. And there wasn't a thing Karen could do to stop it. Meanwhile, Karen seemed oblivious. She continued her parade of violations, now citing me for having non-approved window tint and suspicious garage storage. She started leaving notes on my car windshield that said things like, "This is not your home, and we're watching." My wife called it petty harassment. I called it fuel. On the 7th day, Karen brought 2 security guards to my door. They demanded I show them updated paperwork or leave the premises. I asked for a warrant. They stuttered. I said, "Tell Karen to enjoy her clipboard while she can. She's got about 72 hours left." Then I shut the door. Inside, I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Because in 72 hours, the woman who called me a trespasser was about to discover I owned her paycheck, her petty little rulebook, and the chair she sat in during those ridiculous board meetings. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice served with a twist of irony. And the best part? She still had no idea what was coming. Karen was relentless. By the time the second week rolled around, it felt like I was living in a sitcom written by a control freak with a vendetta against happiness. Every morning, a fresh violation letter would appear taped to my door, stuffed in my mailbox, or, in one dramatic case, tucked under my windshield wiper in a plastic sleeve like some twisted parking ticket. The accusations ranged from mildly annoying to absolutely ridiculous. I was cited for overgrown shrubbery, even though the hedges were exactly 24 inches high, the HOA standard, according to their own manual. Another letter claimed my outdoor grill was emitting unauthorized scents. I stared at that one for a solid minute before laughing and handing it to my wife, who read it, blinked, and said, "So, barbecued chicken is now a crime?" Karen had turned pettiness into a performance art. Every time I stepped outside, she seemed to be lurking. Sometimes she walked her dog by my property 5 times a day, staring through the fence like she expected to catch me hiding a circus elephant. Other times, she just stood across the street, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, pretending to jot down note. She was convinced, absolutely convinced, that I didn't belong in her precious neighborhood. She told everyone who'd listen that I must have forged my ownership documents, that I was probably a squatter who tricked a real estate agent, or even more dramatically, that I was part of some land-grabbing syndicate. No one knew what that meant. Neither did she. I stayed quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't retaliate. I paid the stupid fines without a word, not because I accepted them, but because I didn't want her suspecting anything. The sale of the HOA debt was underway, and if Karen caught even a whiff of what I was planning, she'd try to derail it. I needed her distracted, overconfident, and loud. She did not disappoint. She called for a surprise HOA board meeting and passed around a memo labeling me a suspect resident. The memo claimed my documents could not be authenticated and that I had failed to respond to multiple requests for validation. That was rich, considering I had emailed the HOA copies of every legal file on day one, which they never replied to. Karen even tried to introduce a motion to have me legally removed from the property under a bizarre clause in the HOA charter about illegitimate occupancy. She somehow convinced 4 of the 6 board members to vote in favor, mainly because she screamed until they did. The 7th member, an older gentleman named Roger, abstained and later told me he was retiring from the board because, in his words, "This lady's off her nut." Around that time, Lana called with good news. The bank had finalized the transfer. My shell company, registered under the name Clearview Holdings LLC, was now the majority debt holder for Sterling Estates HOA. The board had unknowingly sold their leash. The next step was converting that debt into a controlling interest through a legal clause buried in their charter. In the event of financial insolvency and board mismanagement, debt-holding entities could assume control through a court-supervised restructuring. Translation: the board had lost their power, and Karen was about to lose her throne. But before I made my move, something happened that almost made me feel bad for her. Almost. I was having coffee at a cafe near town center when I ran into Tanya, the realtor who had helped sell me the house. She greeted me warmly and asked how things were going. I gave her the Cliff Notes version, and when I mentioned Karen's name, her eyes went wide. She laughed and leaned in close, whispering, "You won't believe this, but Karen just called me yesterday. She heard a rumor that the HOA was being bought out and wanted to know who the buyer was." She sounded terrified. I grinned. "Did you tell her?" I asked. Tanya winked and said, "I told her it was probably one of those investment firms that flips neighborhoods into commercial complexes." That made me laugh out loud. Karen, of course, was already spiraling. The very next day, she showed up on my porch with a wicker basket wrapped in crinkled cellophane. Inside were some half-stale chocolates, a bottle of warm white wine, and a printed note that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Let's work together for a better tomorrow." It was signed Sterling Estates HOA. My wife looked at the wine and muttered, "This is the same bottle she screamed at me for bringing to the summer potluck last year." We both laughed, but I knew this was Karen's panic-induced attempt to play nice. Too little, way too late. 3 days later, the court filing went through. Clearview Holdings was officially granted full controlling rights over the HOA's management operations. Karen and her loyal clipboard army had no legal standing anymore. They were done. I had my attorney prepare a notice of transition and an agenda for an emergency homeowners meeting. Everyone would be invited. And yes, Karen would be required to attend. I could hardly sleep the night before the meeting. It felt like Christmas Eve for adults, if Santa Claus were a legal clause and the presents were sweet, sweet justice. When the day arrived, I put on my cleanest shirt, shaved, and made sure to print out the HOA charter in full. Just for fun, I highlighted the section that confirmed the legal transition of authority in cases of debt forfeiture. I also brought copies of every violation Karen had filed against me, just in case anyone forgot how ridiculous she'd been. The community room was packed. Karen stood at the front, arms folded, visibly fuming but trying to maintain her composure. She started speaking before I even reached the podium. "This meeting was not properly sanctioned," she barked. "Who authorized this gathering? I don't recognize this agenda, and neither should you." A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seat. One neighbor whispered, "This should be good." I walked to the front and calmly handed the moderator a thick folder. "These are the court documents confirming transfer of authority from the existing board to the new managing entity, Clearview Holdings." Karen snatched the folder and started flipping through it like she was looking for a typo. I continued, "As the CEO of Clearview Holdings, I am now the legal and acting authority over Sterling Estates' HOA operations. Effective immediately. The room went silent. Karen let out a noise that was half gasp, half growl. You're lying, she shouted. You can't just buy an HOA. This isn't Monopoly. I nodded toward the moderator, who verified the documents and nodded solemnly. It's all legit. I reached into my folder and pulled out a smaller envelope. And Karen, this one's for you, I said. Your position as HOA vice president is hereby terminated. She turned red, then purple, then something in between. She threw the envelope across the room, yelled, "This is a coup!" and stormed out, knocking over a tray of lemonade on her way. No one moved to stop her. No one followed. That night, as I walked back to my house, neighbors I hadn't even met yet came by to shake my hand. One older couple brought brownies. A single dad from 2 blocks over gave me a 6-pack and said, "You've just done what none of us had the guts to do in 10 years. I smiled and replied, I didn't do it for revenge. I did it for peace and barbecue rights. But truthfully, watching Karen's empire crumble was the most satisfying moment of my life. And the best part? I was only getting started. The meeting that followed Karen's meltdown was nothing short of legendary. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood that something massive had shifted in Sterling Estate. Residents who had once whispered in corners now walked the streets with lighter steps. The dark cloud that had hovered over everyone's porch, the constant fear of fines, the passive-aggressive letters, the endless scrutiny, had finally lifted. But while the mood was celebratory, I knew I still had work to do. Karen might have been dethroned, but the damage she caused still lingered. People were wary, uncertain of what came next, and curious about how I planned to wield the authority I now possessed. I had no intention of becoming another Karen. I wanted change, real change, and I knew exactly how to start. 2 days after the transition, I sent out official notices inviting every homeowner to a special HOA town hall. This time hosted outdoors, in the community park, with free coffee and snack. The letter outlined the agenda: a full review of the HOA's policies, a public discussion on Karen's tenure, and a community vote on leadership restructuring. I even included a few lines inviting suggestions and personal testimonies. I expected 20 people to show up. Over 100 came. As neighbors filled the park benches, some stood with folded arms, skeptical, while others smiled nervously and exchanged hopeful glances. I stepped up to the small stage set near the playground, adjusted the mic, and greeted them with a warm, "Good morning, neighbors. It's a new day." A few scattered claps followed. I held up a thick binder and said, "This right here is a record of every fine Karen Dawson issued in the last 18 months. Over 300 of them. Some were legitimate, but most were outrageous. Chalk drawings, Halloween inflatables, wind chimes. One guy got fined for using LED bulbs in his porch light. A man near the back shouted, 'That was me.' The crowd chuckled. I continued, 'I've reviewed each violation. Effective immediately, every frivolous fine is voided. If you've paid one, it will be refunded out of the HOA budget.' That got the applause I was waiting for. Cheers broke out, and people began to relax. I kept going. We're also rewriting the charter. No more vague language. No more secret board meetings. From now on, board members are elected, not appointed. All decisions will be public and community-driven. As I laid out the plans, I noticed Karen lurking at the edge of the park, arms crossed, wearing sunglasses and a hoodie like some retired villain trying to blend in. I ignored her. The crowd was with me. They weren't hers anymore. I opened the floor for testimonies, and that's when the real stories came pouring out. A young mother shared how Karen threatened to have CPS called because her kids played with a hose in the front yard. An elderly man choked up describing how Karen fined him for excessive yard clutter after his wife passed away and he hadn't had the energy to maintain things. A teenager said Karen told him to go back where he came from because he skateboarded in front of her lawn. The stories hit hard, and with each one, The community turned another degree against her. Then came the vote. I had prepared ballots for residents to cast their preference. Dissolve the current board entirely and elect new members, or keep it intact with oversight. The results weren't close. Over 90% voted for complete dissolution. Karen's remaining loyalists, 2 board members and her cousin, left in silence. I handed out nomination forms and opened elections on the spot. Within an hour, we had a list of new candidates, including longtime residents, a retired teacher, and even the teenager with the skateboard. I didn't nominate myself. I didn't want the throne. I just wanted balance. But I wasn't done with Karen yet. The HOA audit team, which I had assembled quietly weeks prior, conducted an official inspection of her property. What they found was a treasure trove of hypocrisy. Karen's backyard had an unapproved gazebo, an above-ground pool never registered, a shed built without a permit, and 3 cats, one more than the HOA limit she had personally enforced on others. Not to mention her mailbox was 2 inches taller than regulation height. All things she'd fined others for. I sent her a formal notice listing 14 violations totaling over $11,000 in fines. She had 30 days to comply or face a lien. That night, she showed up at my house. No clipboard, no sunglasses, just her usual rage simmering under a plastic smile. She knocked aggressively. My wife answered, but I stepped in before she could speak. "Jacob," Karen said through clenched teeth, "this is harassment. You can't do this to me. I built this community." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I simply said, "No, Karen. You built a prison, and now it's being torn down." She stared at me, fists clenched, and finally hissed, "You'll regret this." I shook my head. I've regretted nothing except not doing it sooner. She turned and stormed off into the night, tripping on the edge of our walkway and nearly falling into our rose bush. My wife watched from the porch and said, "She's like a badly written soap opera." I laughed, but the truth was, I knew she wouldn't go down without trying something stupid. And she did. Karen decided her last act of defiance would be to rally a counter-movement. She started a petition to overturn the HOA leadership change, falsely claiming I had used corporate intimidation and illegal tactics to steal power. She canvassed the neighborhood with flyers featuring distorted photos of me looking like a villain. She posted on Nextdoor. She even printed lawn signs that read, "Save Sterling Estates, Stop the Fraud." It backfired spectacularly. Only 6 residents signed her petition. 4 were relatives. One was a man who admitted he thought it was a petition for lower trash fees. And the last? A teenager who signed just to see what would happen. Karen's signs were either stolen, graffitied, or burned. Someone edited them to read, "Save Sterling Estates," from Karen. To make matters worse for her, a local news team caught wind of the HOA shakeup. They reached out for interviews. Karen jumped at the chance, thinking she'd finally tell her side of the story. But the journalist had already spoken to several neighbors, and the footage they aired didn't go as she planned. In her interview, Karen ranted about infiltrators and urban invaders. The station cut to clips of tearful residents describing years of HOA bullying. The headline on the 6 o'clock news was brutal. "HOA nightmare ends. New owner rebuilds after years of abuse." Karen's meltdown was broadcast in full. The final nail came when she tried to crash the community movie night held in the park, which I had organized as part of our Fresh Start initiative. Families gathered, popcorn was served, and laughter echoed under the stars as we screened a light comedy. Karen appeared near the back, muttering to herself, trying to rally people to leave. No one even acknowledged her. A group of kids whispered, "That's the scary lady from the news." One of them ran over to me and handed me a drawing they made. It was Karen with steam coming out of her ears, holding a clipboard that said, "Denied." I taped it to my fridge when I got home. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was community healing. For the first time, Sterling Estates felt like a neighborhood again. And Karen? She was just another chapter in a rulebook that was no longer hers to write. Karen's rage hadn't died. If anything, it had evolved into a new form, less visible but just as venomous. She had stopped screaming publicly and started working behind closed doors, clinging to the belief that she could still claw her way back to power. The community was already transforming. Neighbors were planting flowers without fear. Sidewalk chalk art bloomed like wildflowers. The laughter of children rang out again in places that had once gone silent under Karen's reign. But even as the atmosphere brightened, I could feel something brewing underneath. Karen wasn't done. She was plotting her comeback, and I knew it wouldn't be pretty. The first signs came in the form of flyers. Thin, poorly printed sheets folded into residents' mailboxes without postage or official logos. Each one was written in angry block letters with sentences like, "Sterling Estates is under attack," and "Take back our neighborhood." She accused me of being a corporate plant sent to dismantle the values of the community, claiming I was going to sell the HOA to developers or turn it into a rental complex. She warned of outsiders, bringing in new values that would erase tradition. It was as if she was trying to whip people into a frenzy with fear and nostalgia, but it didn't work the way she expected. Most of the flyers ended up in trash bins. One resident taped theirs to a mailbox and scrawled across it in red ink, "Karen, please go away." Another resident took a picture of their flyer folded into a paper airplane and posted it on the community app with the caption, "It flew better than her arguments." The jokes kept rolling in. A few neighbors even hosted a small comedy night where they acted out Karen's most infamous HOA announcements with dramatic flair. They read citations for illegal flower pots, like they were Shakespearean monologues. Karen, unfortunately, didn't find it funny. In fact, it sent her deeper into meltdown mode. What came next was her most desperate move yet. She attempted to host an emergency neighborhood meeting, completely unofficial, of course. She set up folding chairs on her driveway, placed a speaker on a folding table, and even wore a fake HOA badge she must have made herself. About 5 people showed up. 2 were clearly her relatives. One was the man who signed her petition by accident. The other 2 looked confused and left 10 minutes in. Karen stood there, speaking to an audience of mostly empty chairs, declaring that the illegal regime needed to be overthrown and that she was forming a resistance board. My wife drove by during her speech and said later that Karen was talking into a microphone that wasn't even plugged in. But even as her efforts publicly failed, behind the scenes she was trying something more dangerous. Karen filed a formal complaint with the county clerk's office, accusing me of fraudulent acquisition of HOA authority. She claimed I had used shell companies to exploit a loophole, that I had bribed bank officials, and that I was part of a coordinated attack on private homeowners. She even claimed I forged the judge's signature. It would have been laughable if it hadn't required a real legal response. My lawyer, Lana, handled it swiftly, submitting every shred of documentation necessary to show the sale, foreclosure transfer, and court approval were entirely above board. The complaint was dismissed within a week. The county clerk's response letter even included a footnote warning her about wasting county resources with frivolous claims. Karen, however, told anyone who'd listen that the system was rigged, that the county was in on it, and that dark forces were controlling the narrative. At this point, even the few people who had once sympathized with her were backing away slowly, pretending they hadn't known her that well to begin with. Then came the final blow, and ironically, it wasn't delivered by me. It came from the very system Karen used to control. As part of the HOA overhaul, I had ordered full audits of every board member's tenure, looking into financial records, decision logs, and compliance with bylaws. Karen's file was thicker than anyone's. In just 3 years, she had approved over $40,000 in spending without board consensus. She had used HOA funds to build a shed on her own property under the label Neighborhood Storage Unit, and had paid herself a consulting fee through a bogus company registered under her niece's name. When the findings were presented to the new board, jaws dropped. This wasn't just overreach. It was fraud. I made no dramatic speech this time. I simply handed the findings over to the HOA attorney and allowed the board to vote on legal action. It was unanimous. They filed a civil suit against Karen for misappropriation of HOA funds. The suit included a demand for full repayment, punitive damages, and a lien on her property to secure the claim. Karen was served the notice in her front yard. According to a neighbor, she screamed so loudly the birds flew off in every direction. The next morning, she packed up her car. No goodbye. No explanation. Just loaded up her SUV and drove off. Some said she went to stay with her sister. Others heard she was planning to sell the house and move to Florida. Either way, she was gone. A few kids drew a chalk outline of her clipboard on the sidewalk and wrote, "R.I.P. Karen's Rule," inside it. Someone else made a parody listing on Zillow describing her house as haunted by the ghost of HOA's past. We didn't celebrate her downfall. Not exactly. We just moved forward. I hosted a community brunch 2 days later under the gazebo she once tried to ban for being too cheerful. Families brought dishes, people exchanged garden tools and recipes, and someone set up a karaoke machine that blasted pop songs across the park. It wasn't a party. It was a new beginning. One where fear didn't hang over people's heads like a storm cloud ready to strike. The new board, now made up of real neighbors elected by the community, took its first steps with enthusiasm and care. They voted to lower HOA dues, streamline the violation process, and implement a digital suggestion box for all residents. The community app became a hub for actual connection. Photos of backyard projects, tips on lawn care, posts about local high school fundraisers. The change was slow but real, and people began to smile without looking over their shoulders. One afternoon, I walked past Karen's empty house. The for sale sign was still out front, but it was bent, and the grass had started to yellow from neglect. I stopped and looked at the windows. For years, those windows had served as Karen's watchtower, from which she had ruled with binoculars and a clipboard. Now they stared blankly at the street, silent and meaningless. My dog tugged on the leash, eager to move on. And I did. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching Karen's collapse was like watching a crumbling statue finally topple after years of cracking. It was sad in a way, but mostly it was necessary. She built her power on fear, secrecy, and ego. And all it took to bring her down was sunlight, truth, and a few brave neighbors willing to speak up. The system hadn't failed. It had simply needed someone willing to buy it out, clean it up, and hand it back to the people. What began as a war between me and a clipboard ended in something far greater: a reclaimed community, a shared peace, and a reminder that when the wrong person holds the pen, sometimes the only fix is to rewrite the entire book. The house that once belonged to Karen Dawson finally sold after sitting on the market for 6 long months, each one chipping away at her pride and her finances. She had tried to list it above market value, claiming in her ad that it had executive HOA infrastructure and historic community leadership significance. The realtor quietly edited that last part out. By the end, she accepted an offer $30,000 below her asking price, and even that only came after 2 price cuts and an open house that featured a neighbor across the street loudly warning buyers, "You should have seen the last owner, she fined me for wind." Karen never said goodbye. She disappeared the way her rule did, unnoticed and unmissed. With her gone, the neighborhood healed faster than anyone expected. It was as if a weight had lifted off every doorstep. People who used to sneak glances at each other started waving again. New families moved in, unburdened by the tension that had once ruled every corner. The board, now an open and elected group of residents, thrived. They held monthly meetings in the park, posted transparent updates, and voted on all decisions together. HOA dues were lowered. Excessive fines were repealed. Rules were rewritten in plain English. And most importantly, everyone felt like they had a voice. The best part was watching the smallest things come back to life. That chalk art on the sidewalk? It returned with a vengeance. Smiling suns, hopscotch tracks, and even a full-color dragon someone's kid managed to draw with incredible detail. One resident built a birdhouse tree and invited neighbors to decorate their own boxes. Another converted their front yard into a mini vegetable garden and put up a sign offering free produce to anyone who needed it. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I actually lived in a community and not just a zip code ruled by one person's taste in shrub height and mailbox polish. We even held a proper block party, the first in over 3 years. Live music, food trucks, water balloon fights, and a bouncy castle the size of a small barn. The HOA funded it entirely using leftover discretionary funds that Karen had previously earmarked for more surveillance cameras and fence paint. People danced in the cul-de-sac, kids ran barefoot with sticky popsicle hands, and someone set up a projector for an outdoor movie at sunset. I stood back for a moment, just watching. It was exactly what I had imagined when I bought the house in the first place, before Karen turned the dream into a sitcom nightmare. One of the best ideas we implemented was the community awards. During the party, the new board handed out fun certificates. Best Halloween decorations, friendliest front porch, most likely to share a snow shovel. But the crowd favorite was Biggest HOA Headache, awarded posthumously to Karen. The certificate was taped to a wooden paddleboard someone painted to look like her old clipboard. It now hangs in the community clubhouse under a spotlight, with a caption beneath it that reads, "Never again." Karen's name became lore in the neighborhood. New residents would hear about her within their first week, usually through cautionary tales or during trivia nights where the answer to questions like, "Who once fined a dog for barking during a thunderstorm?" was always, of course, Karen. Her name stopped being associated with fear and became a punchline. Parents joked that if kids didn't finish their veggies, Karen would come back. Someone even started a parody Instagram account called Clipboard Chronicles, where they posted old violation slips and recreated her memos in dramatic fonts with soundtrack music. But there was also reflection. During quieter moments, I sometimes sat on my porch and thought about the strange path that led here. When I moved in, I never expected any of this. I just wanted a quiet home, some peace, and maybe the chance to grill a steak without getting a notice about unauthorized smoke emission. I didn't plan to take over the HOA. I didn't even want to get involved. But life has a way of shoving you into roles you didn't audition for. And when someone like Karen takes hold of power, sometimes the only option is to fight back and fix what they've broken. Eventually, the question came up, would I stay in charge? Several neighbors asked if I'd run for permanent board president, if I'd keep overseeing everything now that the worst was behind us. I appreciated the trust, but I said no. My goal was never to rule. It was to restore balance. So I nominated a neighbor named Evelyn, a retired teacher with patience, empathy, and the organizational skills of a 5-star general. She was unanimously elected. And she's done an even better job than I ever could. I stayed on in an advisory role, helping guide financial restructuring and policy reform, but I let go of the power. That's the funny thing about authority. It's best used when you don't cling to it. And once you give it back to the people it was meant to serve, it becomes something useful instead of something feared. Months later, while walking my dog past the edge of the park, I noticed something new. A small wooden signpost had been installed near the playground, beautifully carved with neighborhood quotes submitted by residents. There were funny ones like, "Don't eat the sidewalk berries," and sweet ones like, "The best part of the neighborhood is the neighbors." But the one that caught my eye was near the bottom. It read, "Power built on fear always breaks, but community? Community bends, grows, and blooms." There was no author listed, but I didn't need one. At the very end of our street, we placed a final symbol. A tall iron gate once sat at the entrance, cold and overly dramatic, put there at Karen's insistence. The board voted to remove it. In its place, we installed a custom archway with a wooden crest carved at the top. It features a smiling sun, blooming trees, and a small clipboard snapped in half. We call it the Gate of Change. Every new homeowner passes under it on their way to their new home, greeted not by suspicion, but by welcome signs, warm faces, and a laminated welcome kit with a magnet that reads, "You're home now." I never saw Karen again. She vanished from the public eye after the lawsuit, which was quietly settled out of court. Rumor had it she lost a large chunk of her savings and was living in a condo where she had no authority. Some said she joined another HOA, but this time as a silent resident who kept her head down. Fitting, really. Even queens of clipboards eventually run out of ink. The final chapter wasn't one of vengeance or bragging. It was one of renewal. Of a neighborhood that had been broken by one woman's obsession with control but rebuilt by the people who refused to let fear win. I didn't just get my house. I got my peace. And in the process, I helped others find theirs. On a cool evening not long after, I was sitting on my porch swing with my wife, sipping iced tea while the sun dipped below the rooftop. A delivery driver stopped outside our gate, stepped out, and looked at the new arch. He squinted at the broken clipboard on top, then at me. "Hey," he said with a curious smile, "wasn't this the place with that crazy HOA lady?" I grinned. "It used to be," I said. "Now it's just home." And as he nodded and drove off, I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the sound of laughter echoing down the street, a melody sweeter than any victory speech I could have given.